My presentation will focus on a research project that I've been developing for a couple of years now on online service providers transparency discourse. I've analyzed this from multiple angles. This particular paper focuses mainly on ideological features of online service providers and their discourse and practices from 2010 roughly to 2019, 2020. So this is a study of initiatives promoting transparency, that showing that major online service providers have implemented the transparency lexicon in discourse and practices addressing important regulatory and public perception concerns regarding their commercial activities. Mainly, I argue that OSP transparency, or that is online service provider transparency, is enacted as a dispositive, including verbal and non-verbal communication alongside normative and technological elements. So I'll start by briefly sketching out my theoretical framework, and then provide some examples, some of my main findings, and then some conclusions and further research. Therefore, kind of a roadmap. So my theoretical underpinnings are, very simple. I draw from Foucault's work, and mostly his genealogical approach and concept of dispositive. I draw from ideological analysis, very inspired by Theo van Dijk's idea of concepts of ideological analysis, and from Jacques Ellul's theory of propaganda. So I argue that online service provider transparency-related initiatives have undergone significant shifts as the discourse and practices mirror changes in corporate strategy and in the socio-political context. Transparency generally presented as identical to ethical behavior and self-regulation, and opposed to regulatory overreach and governmental bureaucracy. My heuristic approach focuses on the multiple dimensions of transparency instead of an examination of transparency as a fixed value or principle. So if you're familiar with Deleuze's and Foucault's concepts of dispositive or apparatus, dispositif, they challenge approaches based on ontological unidirectionality and determinism, and argue that dispositives are constituted by multiple elements proceeding from open-ended processes. So the creation of new frameworks of subjectivity. A dispositional analysis of transparency practices and discourses has the advantage, in my view, of allowing the understanding transparency as a construction of a social, technological, discursive, and normative ontology rather than a fixed ethical or communicational framework. So I treat transparent platform transparency, or OSP transparency, in this context as the creation of an apparatus through processes of institutionalization, subjectivation, and objectivation, in which platform users, regulators, clients, and others are implicated and assigned roles according to this strategic mindset, or the strategic corporate mindset. So Jacques Ellul, if you're familiar with Jacques Ellul's categories of propaganda, or his theory of propaganda, he distinguishes multiple types of propaganda. While a popular approach to propaganda typically focuses on top-down directionalities and centrally produced communications with persuasive purposes, Ellul's presented a much more comprehensive, to my view, topology focused on propaganda as a kind of orthopraxis, that is an action-oriented, that rather than adherence-enabling kind of propaganda. So his multiple categories of propaganda. So it starts by distinguishing political and sociological propaganda. The first consisting of, and I quote, techniques of influence employed by a government, a party, or administration, a pressure group, with a view to changing the behavior of the public. Sociological propaganda is defined as the penetration of an ideology by means of its ideological context, which is a relatively opaque definition. Then it distinguishes agitation and integration propaganda, agitation being overcoming the given situation led by opposition to overthrow enemies. That is usually in a revolutionary situation. Then we have integration propaganda, which aims to stabilize rather than destabilizing the social body. Then we have vertical versus horizontal propaganda, the first corresponding to the classic definition of propaganda as a top-down phenomenon, and horizontal propaganda as a form of participatory propaganda directed by members of a given group to foster the adherence from other members. There's also the last distinction between rational propaganda and irrational propaganda, another rather poorly chosen terminology, but rational propaganda rests on the communication of quantifiable and verifiable data, though it has a definite quantitative orientation, whereas irrational propaganda relies on the manipulation of human emotion. Therefore, being much more akin to that classical view of propaganda as the manipulation of mass sentiment. I haven't talked about methodologies yet, so this research relies on the qualitative discourse analysis of around 400 blog entries and other types of textual communications from online service providers. We started with Facebook, Microsoft, and Google's communications, and pronouncements and other and interviews and Senate hearings of their CEOs and of their managers and people in charge, and we try to find some action, practical oriented and theoretical definitions of transparency in these blog entries. So the idea was to try to understand how transparency is constructed both in discourse and in practice, being that the production of textual elements and the participation of corporate representatives in these hearings and in the public sphere has obvious performative purposes, and therefore there isn't a hard ontological distinction between practices and between practice and discourse. Of course, it was mainly the distinction is here mainly to allow us to distinguish between how the vocabulary and the lexical field is constructed normatively and how it is enacted through the construction, for example, of technological tools and norms within the platforms. So, for example, this is a blog post, it's a Facebook post by Mark Zuckerberg in November 2008, where we have multiple elements that we also found during this period, 2010-2020, in Facebook's textual production. It argues for the creation of the right regulations, acceptable rates of problematic content, drawing the lines between free expression and safety, and the need to co-create regulatory approaches, being that obviously companies are relatively free to create their own governmentality within their own platforms. Now, this is obviously just a single example, but it as we'll see in other examples, there are some there are a lot of regularities in this kind of textual production, even though the transparency discourse varies quite a bit and changes quite a bit between 2010 and 2020 within Facebook and as well as within other platforms. But we'll talk about that diachronics of transparency in a while. As you'll see in Google in 2009, seems to more or less align with Mark Zuckerberg's words by saying that transparency is one of the best, if not the best, way to promote best practices and eliminate abuses within the platforms. Of course, the backdrop for all this, the context for all this, is the if you will, the fake news crisis and the rise in divisive materials within the platforms, which have generated a massive public outcry, a massive political backlash, and have therefore forced platforms to address these concerns in a more direct way. But still, being that as it may, the discourse, the transparency discourse, focuses on this auto regulation rather than external supervision. So as you see, they arguing for transparency and arguing for flexibility does not preclude companies from continuing to implement continue to change their platforms and to continue to introduce technological innovations into those platforms and expanding their reach, expanding the amount of data they gather. What they believe is that the regulation should just accompany these innovations in a way that does not hamper their own commercial activities. So they argue against these legal frameworks that attempt to establish regulation in a significant manner by saying that there is no one-size-fits-all kind of regulatory approach. One of the elements in transparency reports, in transparency that we analyze, are transparency reports and transparency hubs. These are part of corporate social responsibility discourse and corporate social responsibility approaches from these companies, and they include an absolute avalanche of data and textual production on transparency, social responsibility, on law enforcement cooperation, policy, community guidelines, etc., etc. Facebook produces transparency reports. Microsoft has this transparency hub I just showed you. More recently, in 2017, 2018, Facebook created what they call the ad library that provides access to information about political and commercial advertising on the platform. It allows us to access and analyze political advertising and other advertising, and as well as who pays for what. So this obviously did not exist before 2016 and 2015. These are new tools designed as responses to the crisis created by the circulation of information in these platforms. So it clearly shows how companies are trying to adapt their transparency approach and the transparency discourse to changes in the online environment and changes in the social political context. The images you seem to be seeing have a bit of a lag, so I'm probably just moving forward a bit faster than I should in my examples. But the examples I'm showing you are all pertain to Facebook's ad library and to Facebook's ad archive reports, which show who spends what and how in what manner. So this is 2000 this was 2018 in the US. This is 2018 in Brazil. So we can see advertising expenses as well as the ads proper. So this kind of approach, or this kind of commitment to transparency and to adding new tools that allow us to analyze transparency and to verify platform transparency are not new. They are being created since 2011, and what I found in this research project is that there is a clear evolution, or there are clear phases in this approach to transparency. So first of all, let's say that these companies have framed transparency in multiple ways during the last 10 years, and different phases of the conceptual and practical construction of platform transparency correspond to shifts in the geopolitical and socioeconomic contexts, and they consist of adjustments in the response of digital platforms. For Facebook, and we'll focus mainly on Facebook just because that's the most direct and well-developed example I have. Transparency initiatives were initially related to data protection and internal governance in the context of the growth of social political activity on the platform. Let's think, for example, about about Arab Spring. So generalized optimism about the economy and democratic potential of social network services at this time produced glowing assessments of the role of these companies and their platforms and the role that they had to play on the geopolitical level. So Hillary Clinton gave a speech entitled Remarks on Internet Freedom in 2010, just extolling the democratic potential of online platforms. So between 2009 and 2012, posts on Facebook's corporate weblog drew on the semantics of community, that is Facebook as a community and not merely an online community enabling service, to signal their commitment to the protection of user data. So at this time, like I said, public perception of social network services was still focused on democratizing potential of social media. And the general tone on Facebook reinforced the idea of an online community. But in 2013, Facebook started publishing what they called at the time their Global Government Request Report, which now, which is the precursor of its current transparency report. This was in the wake of the Edward Snowden revelations about generalized online governmental surveillance built upon social network services, commercial surveillance. So in this phase, there was already a big difference in that the discourse and practice of transparency became much more focused on the platform's response to takedown requests and demands for user information on the part of sovereign states, governments, and judicial systems. This was the real reason behind the release of transparency reports. Transparency reports are quantified biannual reports of the number and nature of governmental requests. More and more companies have been publishing them since 2013. Google publishes their transparency report since 2009, if I'm not mistaken, or 2010. Facebook was not an exception to the platform's general commitment to curbing extremist, let's say terrorist-related content, both as a social political goal and as a community-oriented goal, that is, in identifying terrorist content on their respective hosted consumer platforms. Expunging the platforms of terrorist content by tagging it with hashes and registering in the database, as we saw in the example of Facebook's ad library, was presented as a user protection measure, but it was also critically important in order to avoid the perception that social network services were tools for terrorist radicalization. It is at this point that a dispositive of transparency is established, comprised of technical tools, community norms, community guidelines as well. And this is very important for the dispositive of transparency and for us to understand how these companies align regarding transparency. Very wide partnerships with other companies, universities, researchers, NGOs, and governments. For example, the drive against terrorism drove the GAFAM, the Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, to a mutual agreement and the formation of a coalition for addressing the issue. And in 2017, we witnessed the first, what they call the first global internet forum against terrorism. This accelerated from 2016 and 2017 after the Brexit referendum and the US presidential elections, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal and reports of manipulation of political advertising. So my time is running out, so I won't expand on every single thing. But I think you got I think everyone understood what I'm trying to do here. The expansion and of the technical and normative dispositive of transparency can be seen in the creation of these ad libraries and advertising analysis tools, wherein the origin and the funds spent in political advertising are disclosed. So they also created flagging tools, fact-checking nodes, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So in sum, the dispositive of transparency is an ongoing construct. It emerges from this growing set of practices and norm building activities, and can be traced to public sentiment and political willingness to discuss the impact of platforms in public life. In this regard, I believe that an argument can be made for a Malthusian matrix of transparency as propaganda. First, because social and political sentiment establishes the background for this messaging. Secondly, because the strategic political and social goals in the promotion of transparency are action-focused, action-enabled. They try to implement bold and new initiatives to promote their own goals and companies, and in the sense that they also feed into general political hesitation in regulating the online monopolies. They're also quantified, and so they fall within this rationalistic quantification of transparency as a tool for persuasion, supporting the argument for the competence of platforms to self-regulate because of the way they gather data and the way they use their data to give feedback on how to regulate the platform itself. So these platforms are strategically situated between the communicational, normative, technical, political, and economic realms. And they use transparency to assuage public fears of impacts, keep regulatory drives to a minimum, to ensure the protection of their own intellectual property, and also to ensure the continuity of revenue streams and the stability of advertising in particular. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.